10. Julian and Aldous. When it is necessary to modify or renew fundamental doctrine, the generations sacrificed to the era during which the transformation takes place remain essentially alienated from that transformation, and often become directly hostile to it. Auguste Comte, Un appel aux conservateurs. Toward noon, Bruno got back into his car and drove into Parthenay. He decided to take the expressway after all. He stopped at a phone booth and called his brother, who answered immediately. He was on his way back to Paris and wondered if he could see him that evening. He wouldn't be free the following evening. He was seeing his son, but he was tonight. It was important. Michel was impassive. "If you want," he said after a long pause. Like most people, he found he loathed what the sociologists and commentators like to call the atomization of society. Also, like most, he thought it was important to stay in touch with one's family, even if it meant a certain amount of hassle. For years he had made himself spend every Christmas with his aunt, Marie-Thérèse, at her house in Raincy, where she was living out her declining years with her husband. His uncle was practically deaf. A kind-hearted man, he had voted communist all his life and refused to go to midnight mass, which always started an argument. Michel listened as the old man talked about emancipating the working man and sipped gentian tea. From time to time, he would yell something banal in response. Then the others arrived. Michel was fond of his cousin Brigitte. He wanted her to be happy, but the fact that her husband was a bastard made that rather unlikely. He was a sales rep with Bayer, and cheated on his wife whenever he had the opportunity. As he was a handsome man and travelled a lot, he had quite a lot of opportunities. Every year, Brigitte's face grew a little more gaunt. Michel stopped making his annual visit in 1990, though there was still Bruno. Family relationships last for years, sometimes decades, much longer, in fact, than any kind of relationship. Then, finally, they too got her out. When Bruno arrived at about 9 o'clock, he had already had a couple of drinks and was eager to talk philosophy. "I've always been struck by how accurate Huxley was in Brave New World," he began before he'd even sat down. "It's phenomenal when you think he wrote it in 1932. Everything that's happened since simply brings Western society closer to the social model he described. Control of reproduction is more precise, and eventually will be completely disassociated from sex altogether. And procreation will take place in tightly guarded laboratories where perfect genetic conditions are ensured. Once that happens, any sense of family, of father-son bonds will disappear. Pharmaceutical companies will break down the distinction between youth and age. In Huxley's world, a 60-year-old man is as healthy as a man of 20, looks as young, and has the same desires. When we get to the point that life can't be prolonged any further, we'll be killed off by voluntary euthanasia. Quick, discreet, emotionless. The society Huxley describes in Brave New World is happy. Tragedy and extremes of human emotion have disappeared. Sexual liberation is total. Nothing stands in the way of instant gratification. Oh, there are little moments of depression, of sadness or doubt, but they're easily dealt with using advances in antidepressants and tranquilizers. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments. This is exactly the sort of world we're trying to create, the world we want to live in." "Oh, I know," Bruno went on, waving his hand as if to dismiss an objection Michel had not voiced. "Everyone says Brave New World is supposed to be a totalitarian nightmare, a vicious indictment of society. But that's hypocritical bullshit. Brave New World is our idea of heaven. Genetic manipulation, sexual liberation, the war against aging, the leisure society. This is precisely the world that we have tried, and so far failed, to create. The only thing in the book that rankles a little with our idea of equal opportunities, or meritocracy, is the idea of dividing society into castes, where each performs tasks according to their genetic makeup. But that's also the point on which Huxley proved a false prophet. Advances in automation and robotics have made the whole idea pointless. Oh, Huxley was a terrible writer, I admit. His writing is pretentious and clumsy, his characters are bland ciphers, but he had one vital premonition. He understood that for centuries, the evolution of human society had been linked to scientific and technological progress, and would continue to be more and more so. He may have lacked style or finesse or psychological insight, but that's insignificant compared with the accuracy of the original concept. Huxley was the first writer to realize that biology would take over from physics as the driving force of society, long before other sci-fi writers. Bruno stopped and noticed that his brother seemed worried and gaunt. He was clearly tired and had been paying little attention. In fact, he hadn't bothered to go shopping for days. Poverty was usually less oppressive in the summer months, though there were more beggars than ever outside Monoprix this year. What would it be like when war came? Michel wondered as he watched the slow tread of the beggars from his bay window. When would war break out? And what would that mean to the back-to-school rush? Bruno poured himself another glass of wine. He was getting hungry and was surprised when his brother spoke in a weary voice. Huxley came from a large family of English biologists. His grandfather was a friend of Darwin's. He wrote a lot in defense of Darwin's theory of natural selection. His father and his brother Julian were also famous biologists. They were pragmatic, skeptical intellectuals in the English liberal mold, a tradition based more on observation and on experimental methods than was the French Enlightenment. As a boy, Huxley had the opportunity to meet many economists, judges, and particularly scientists who were regular visitors to his father's house. He was certainly the only writer of his generation who understood the impact biology would have. It would all have happened much faster if it hadn't been for the war. Nazi ideology completely discredited eugenics and the idea of improving the race. It was decades before anyone thought about it again. Michel went over to the bookshelf and took down What Dare I Think and handed it to Bruno. It was written by Julian Huxley, Aldous' older brother, and published in 1931, a year before Brave New World. All of the ideas his brother used in the novel, genetic manipulation and improving the species, including the human species, are suggested here. All of them are presented as unequivocally desirable goals that society should strive for. Michel sat down again and wiped his forehead. In 1946, just after the war, Julian Huxley was appointed Director General of UNESCO, which had just been founded. Aldous Huxley had just published Brave New World Revisited, in which he tried to portray the first novel as a social satire. Years later, Aldous would become a pillar of the hippie experiment. He had always been in favor of complete sexual liberation, and he was a pioneer in the use of psychedelic drugs. The founding members of Esalen met him and were taken with his ideas. Then the New Age came along and recycled all the ideas of Esalen. Aldous Huxley is probably one of the most influential thinkers of the century. They went to a Chinese restaurant on the corner, which offered a set meal for two at 270 francs. Michel had not been out of his apartment in 3 days. "I haven't eaten today," he said, slightly surprised. He was still carrying the book. In 1962, he went on as he stirred his sticky rice, Huxley published his last book, Island. It's set on a utopian tropical island, probably based on Sri Lanka, given the scenery and the vegetation. On the island, a civilization has developed which has completely bypassed the great commercial currents of the 20th century. The civilization is technologically advanced, but still respectful of nature. The natives are pacifists, and completely immune to family neuroses and Judeo-Christian inhibitions. Nudism is accepted as normal. Sensuality and sexuality are freely practiced. The book was second-rate, but it was easy to read, and it had an enormous effect on hippies and, through them, on New Agers. If you look at it closely, the harmonious society in Ireland has a lot in common with Brave New World. Huxley was probably senile by that time. He didn't seem to notice the similarities himself. The society in Ireland is as close to Brave New World as hippie liberalism is to bourgeois liberalism, or rather to its Swedish social democratic variant. He paused, dipped a shrimp into the chili sauce, and then put down his chopsticks. Like his brother, Aldous was an optimist, he said with something like disgust. The metaphysical mutation that gave rise to materialism and modern science in turn spawned two great trends, rationalism and individualism. Huxley's mistake was in having poorly evaluated the balance of power between these two. Specifically, he underestimated the growth of individualism brought about by an increased consciousness of death. Individualism gives rise to freedom, the sense of self, the need to distinguish oneself and to be superior to others. A rational society, like the one he describes in Brave New World, can diffuse the struggle. Economic rivalry, a metaphor for mastery over space, has no more reason to exist in a society of plenty, where the economy is strictly regulated. Sexual rivalry, a metaphor for mastery over time through reproduction, has no more reason to exist in a society where the connection between sex and procreation has been broken. But Huxley forgets about individualism. He doesn't understand that sex, even stripped of its link with reproduction, still exists, not as a pleasure principle, but as a form of narcissistic differentiation. The same is true of the desire for wealth. Why has the Swedish model of social democracy never triumphed over liberalism? Why has it never been applied to sexual satisfaction? Because the metaphysical mutation brought about by modern science leads to individuation, vanity, malice, and desire. Any philosopher, not just Buddhist or Christian, but any philosopher worthy of the name, knows that in itself, desire, unlike pleasure, is a source of suffering, pain, and hatred. The utopian solution, from Plato to Huxley by way of Fourier, is to do away with desire and the suffering it causes by satisfying it immediately. The opposite is true of the sex and advertising society we live in, where desire is marshaled and blown up out of all proportion, while satisfaction is maintained in the private sphere. For society to function, for competition to continue, people have to want more and more, until desire fills their lives and finally devours them. He wiped his forehead, exhausted. He hadn't touched his food. There are some correctives, Bruno said softly. Some humanist touches which help people forget about death. In Brave New World, it's tranquilizers and antidepressants. In Ireland, it's hallucinogens, meditation, and some vague Hindu mysticism. In our own society, people try to use a mixture of both. Julian Huxley gives over the second part of What Dare I Think to discussing religion, retorted Michel, clearly contemptuous. He's well aware that science and materialism have completely undermined traditional spirituality, but he also realizes that society cannot survive without religion. He spends about 100 pages trying to set out the principles of a religion which could dovetail with science. The results aren't terribly convincing, and certainly society hasn't followed the route he suggested. In fact, any attempt at fusing science and religion is doomed by the knowledge of physical mortality, so cruelty and egotism cannot fail to spread. In compensation, he concluded bizarrely, the same is true of love. 11. After Bruno's visit, Michel took to his bed for 2 weeks. How could society function without religion, he wondered. It seemed difficult enough for an individual human being. For several days he studied the radiator beside his bed. It was a useful and ingenious device. When it was cold, the pipes filled with hot water. But how long could Western civilization continue without some kind of religion? As a child, he liked to water the plants in the kitchen garden. He still had a small black and white photograph of himself at the age of 6, holding the watering can, watched over by his grandmother. Later, he liked to go on errands. With the change from the bread money, he was allowed to buy a carambar. Then he would fetch the milk from the farm, swinging the aluminium pail of still warm milk at arm's length. And he was a little bit afraid as he walked back at nightfall, along the deserted path hedged with brambles. Now every trip to the supermarket was torture, though the stock changed regularly, and they were always introducing new TV dinners for one. He'd recently, for the first time, seen ostrich steak in the meat section of Monoprix. To facilitate reproduction, the two helices which make up the DNA molecule separate before each attracts complementary nucleotides. The moment of separation is dangerous, as it is then that random mutations, mostly harmful, occur. The impression of intellectual stimulation created by fasting is real. And by the end of the first week, Michel had the intuition that perfect reproduction was impossible, while DNA was in the form of a double helix. To obtain an exact replication across an indefinite succession of cellular generations, it would probably be necessary for genetic information to be on a compact structure, for example, a Mobius strip or a torus. As a child, he could not bear the deterioration of objects, the breakage, the wear and tear. For years, he continually taped 2 broken ends of a plastic ruler together again. With all the layers of tape, the ruler was now lopsided. To draw a straight line was impossible, so it didn't even fulfill the basic function of a ruler. Nevertheless, he kept it. Then it would break again, and he would repair it, adding another layer of tape, and put it back in his pencil case. One of the marks of Jasinski's genius Frédéric Houellebecq would write many years later, was his ability to go beyond his first intuition that sexual reproduction was, in itself, a source of deleterious mutations. For millions of years, human societies had instinctively made the incontrovertible link between sex and death. A scientist who had irrefutably established such a link in molecular biological terms would normally consider his work done and leave it at that. Jasinski, however, understood it was necessary to look past the framework of sexual reproduction to study the general topological conditions of cell division. From his first week at primary school in Charny, Michel had been struck by the cruelty of boys. It's true that the little beasts were farmers' sons, and therefore closer to animals than most. Nevertheless, it was startling to witness the instinctive, unaffected, joyful way they stabbed frogs with a compass point or a fountain pen, violet ink blossoming beneath the skin of the unfortunate animal as it slowly suffocated to death. They would gather in a circle, their eyes bright, to watch its final agony. Another of their favorite games was to cut the antennae off snails with their round-ended children's scissors. All of the snail's sensory awareness comes from its antennae, crowned by the eyes. Without them, the snail is reduced to a pulpous mass, suffering and helpless. Michel quickly realized that he should keep his distance from these young savages. There was little to fear from girls, however, more gentle creatures. The instinctive notion of the world was confirmed every Wednesday night when he watched the animal kingdom. Amid the vile filth, the ceaseless carnage which was the lot of animals, the only glimmer of devotion and altruism was the protective maternal instinct, which had gradually evolved into mother love. The female squid, a pathetic little thing barely 20 centimeters long, unhesitatingly attacks the diver who comes near her eggs. 30 years later, he could not come to any other conclusion. Women were indisputably better than men. They were gentler, more affectionate, loving, and compassionate. They were less prone to violence, selfishness, cruelty, or self-centeredness. Moreover, they were more rational, intelligent, and hard-working. What on earth were men for? Michel wondered as he watched sunlight play across the curtains. In earlier times, when bears were more common, perhaps masculinity served a particular and irreplaceable function. But for centuries now, men clearly served no useful purpose. For the most part, they assuaged their boredom playing tennis, which was a lesser evil. But from time to time, they felt the need to change history, which basically meant inciting revolutions or wars. Aside from the senseless suffering they caused, revolutions and wars destroyed the best of the past, forcing societies to rebuild from scratch. Without regular and continuous progress, human evolution took random, irregular, and violent turns for which men, with their predilection for risk and danger, their repulsive egotism, their irresponsibility, and their violent tendencies, were directly to blame. A world of women would be immeasurably superior, tracing a slower but unwavering progression, with no U-turns and no chaotic insecurity, toward a general happiness. On the morning of 15th August he went out, hoping that the streets would be deserted, which they were. He took some notes, which he would stumble across 10 years later while writing his most important paper, toward a science of perfect reproduction. At precisely that moment, Bruno, exhausted and despairing, was taking his son back to his ex-wife. Anne had just come back from a package tour with Nouvelle Frontière to Easter Island or Benin. He couldn't remember which. She had probably made friends with some of the women on the trip. They would have exchanged addresses, and she would see them once or twice before growing bored with them. She certainly would not have met any men. Bruno had the impression that she had completely given up on everything having to do with men. She would take him aside for a minute or two and ask how things had been. He would say, "Fine," in the calm, self-assured tone that women like, before adding, a little facetiously, "Though Victor did watch a lot of television." He would quickly feel uncomfortable, as, since she had given up smoking, Anne wouldn't tolerate it in her tastefully furnished apartment. As he got up to leave, he would be choked with regret and again wonder what he could do to make things different. He would kiss Victor quickly and then go. His vacation with his son would be over. In truth, the 2 weeks they spent together had been a nightmare. Lying on his bed with a bottle of bourbon in his hand, he listened to the sounds of his son in the next room, the toilet flushing after he pissed, the buzz of the remote control. Just like his half-brother, though he did not know it, he stared dumbly at the radiator for hours at a time. Victor slept on the sofa bed in the living room and spent 15 hours a day watching television. The set was already on by the time Bruno woke up every morning. Victor would be watching cartoons on M6 with the sound down and his headphones on. He was not a violent boy and did not mean to be rude, but he and his father had absolutely nothing to say to each other. Twice a day, Bruno would heat something in the microwave, and they would eat at the table with hardly a word. How had it come to this? Victor had just turned 14. Some years before, he spent his time drawing pictures he would bring over for his father to see. He copied characters from Marvel Comics, Fatalis, Fantastic, the Pharaoh of the Future, and made up stories for them. Sometimes they would play a game of mille bornes, and on Sunday mornings they would go to the Louvre. When he was 6, Victor had made a card for his father's birthday. On heavy drawing paper he had written in big multicolored letters, "I love you, Dad." Now all that was past, over and done with. Bruno knew things would only get worse, that they would move from mutual indifference to loathing. In a couple of years his son would try to go out with girls his own age, the same 15-year-old girls that Bruno lusted after. They would come to be rivals, which was the natural relationship between men. They would be like animals fighting in a cage, and the cage was time. On the way home, Bruno stopped at a local Arab grocery and bought 2 bottles of pastis. Then, before he drank himself into a stupor, he phoned his brother to arrange to see him the following day. When he arrived at Michel's apartment, he found his brother, suddenly famished after weeks of fasting, stuffing himself with Italian salami between great gulps of wine. "Help yourself," he said vaguely. "Help yourself." It seemed to Bruno as though he was barely listening. It was like talking to a wall or a psychiatrist, but he talked nonetheless. "For years my son turned to me for love, and I rejected him. I was depressed. I hated my life. I thought there'd be a time when I felt better. I didn't realize how quickly the years would go by. Between 7 and 12, the child is an astonishing being, kind, rational, and open, full of joy, and convinced that the world is a logical place. He's full of love, and happy to accept what love we're prepared to give. After that, it all goes wrong. It all goes horribly wrong." Michel gobbled down the last 2 slices of salami and poured himself another glass of wine. His hands were trembling violently. Bruno continued, "There's nothing more stupid, aggressive, hateful, or obnoxious than a teenage boy, especially when he's with boys his own age. He is a monster crossed with an imbecile. He's unbelievably conformist. At puberty, a boy is the sudden, malicious, and unpredictable, considering the child he was, crystallization of the very worst in mankind. When you think about it, sexuality has to be an absolutely evil force. I don't know how people can live under the same roof as kids like that. I think the only reason they can stomach it is because their lives are completely empty. Though I suppose my life is completely empty, and I didn't manage it. In any case, the world is full of liars. People spend their lives telling appalling lies. We're divorced now, but we're still good friends. I get to see my son every other weekend. That's bullshit. Complete bullshit. In reality, men don't give a damn about their kids. They never really love them. In fact, I'd say men aren't capable of love. The emotion is completely alien to them. The only emotions they know are desire, in the form of pure animal lust, and male rivalry. There used to be a time when, late in life, a man would come to feel a certain affection for his spouse, though not before she'd borne his children, made a home for them, cooked, cleaned, and proved herself in the bedroom. That sort of regard meant they enjoyed sleeping in the same bed. It was probably not what the women were looking for, and it might even have been a delusion, but it could be a powerful feeling. Strong enough that even if men still became excited, though to a decreasing degree, at getting a little piece of ass on the side from time to time, they literally could not live without their wives. When, out of unhappiness, their wives left them, they hit the bottle and died soon afterward, often in a matter of months. Children existed solely to inherit a man's trade, his moral code, and his property. This was taken for granted among the aristocracy, But merchants, craftsmen, and peasants also bought into the idea, so it became the norm at every level of society. That's all gone now. I work for someone else. I rent my apartment from someone else. There's nothing for my son to inherit. I have no craft to teach him. I haven't a clue what he might do when he's older. By the time he grows up, the rules I live by will have no value. He will live in another universe. If a man accepts the fact that everything must change, then he accepts that life is reduced to nothing more than the sum of his own experience. Past and future generations mean nothing to him. That's how we live now. For a man to bring a child into the world now is meaningless. Women are different because they continue needing to have someone to love, which is not and has never been true of men. It's bullshit to pretend that men need to fuss over their children, play with them, or cuddle them. I know people have been saying it for years, but it's bullshit. After divorce, once the family unit has broken down, a man's relationship with his children is nonsensical. Kids are a trap that is closed. They are the enemy. You have to pay for them all your life, and they outlive you. Michel got up and went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He could see coloured wheels spinning in midair and felt like throwing up. First, he had to stop his hands from shaking. Bruno was right. Paternal love was a lie, a fiction. A lie is useful if it transforms reality, he thought. But if it fails, then all that's left is the lie, the bitterness and the knowledge that it was a lie. When he came back, Bruno was curled up in the armchair, as still as if he were dead. Night was falling over the towers, and, after another stifling day, the temperature was bearable again. Suddenly Michel noticed the empty cage, where for years his canary had lived. He would have to throw it out, as he had no intention of getting another pet. For a moment he thought of his neighbour opposite, the girl who worked en Vingt-un, whom he hadn't seen for months. She probably had moved out. He forced himself to concentrate on his hands and saw they were shaking a little less. Bruno still had not moved. The silence between them continued for some minutes.